So this is our first panel of a full day of panels. It's dedicated to the topic of the medium, and Toke Lykkeberg, who is the moderator of today's panel, will give a more detailed introduction into the topic shortly. For now, I would just like to very briefly introduce Toke. Toke is a freelance curator and author based in Copenhagen. He's currently working on the Nordic Biennial for Contemporary Art entitled Tunnel Vision, opening in Norway in June, and a group show in collaboration with this at the Musée d'Art Moderne in Paris in October. He's the former director and co-founder of the Artistran space IMO, or IMO, I actually don't know how it is pronounced, okay?
Both are good.
Both are good, in Copenhagen, and has curated numerous exhibitions, and most recently the group show L'Embarras à Torres at the project space Torres in Copenhagen, the exhibition Branding as Branding, the Making of Superflex at Kunsthal Charlottenborg in Copenhagen, and the group exhibition Rematerialized at New Gallery, which is of special importance for this panel, in Paris and New York. He also regularly contributes to the Nordic website Kunstkritik, again not sure about the pronunciation, and this magazine. And with that, I would like to hand it over to you, Toke. And I think you need to speak in that microphone.
Oh fuck. Okay, thank you. That was a very long introduction to me, too long. Because I might do shorter introductions actually to you guys. Thank you so much for inviting me, Melanie. Thank you for inviting these super interesting speakers. Thank you to Haus der Kulturen, der Welt. And actually, when I got this invitation, I was puzzled and a bit like afraid I couldn't moderate this talk, because I was like, the digital as medium, well, maybe the internet as medium, but I couldn't make it make sense. I thought, oh, this is an outdated question. This is sort of like us, art professionals, art historians, trying to make our old categories, such as the medium, matter today in the digital age where art implodes in culture. And then I just said this to Melanie, like I was a bit puzzled, and then she said, "You got it." And then I was like, "Okay, cool. Well, clever lady. This sounds interesting. I'm up for this." So digitization, you could say it results in media convergence, and it has threatened the quasi-totality of all mediums, from painting to television to video. But maybe it has also simply conserved the mediums by transforming them. So, quickly, what's a medium? Well, this is the territory occupied heavily by Clement Greenberg, the art critic in the 50s. And just briefly, so he said that painting is made of paint and canvas, and then he proposed defining painting as a medium by its materials. And this is such a simple way of talking about art that it was hugely influential, and it has remained influential, but also because everybody since has tried to debunk his ideas. And that will probably continue today. We got in the 70s, we got computer scientist Alan Kay, who announced the future of information technology. He talked about the computer as meta-medium, and I brought along one quote. "Although digital computers were originally designed to do arithmetic computation, the ability to simulate the details of any descriptive model means that the computer, viewed as a medium itself, can be all other media if the embedding and viewing methods are sufficiently well provided." And then quickly we got, in the 90s, we got Rosalind Krauss talking about post-medium age, and we got Lev Manovich articulating his post-media aesthetics, and at the same moment he talked about post-digital and post-net art, and that leads us today to stuff like post-internet art. with writers such as Marie Olsen talking about it. And then we could basically say, well, that maybe digitization is not really dematerialization and debunking of the old ideas. We have the 3D printer, part of the Internet of Things, where old mediums are rematerializing and back in shape and reasserting themselves in new ways. So maybe this talk today is, again, highly relevant. I cannot help thinking about the tech guru, Kevin Kelly, who says that new technology does not wipe out old technology. We have, for instance, still all these strange old horse carriages around. The same goes with art history, and people like us here, both the public and the speakers. I would like to introduce the first speaker. That's Maeve Connolly, and I think she is no longer mourning the loss during the digital age. She is a lecturer and a theorist, and your last book came out last year. TV Museum is the main title, and I'll give you the word now.
Shall I head up there?
Yeah, please.
So I want to thank Melanie also for including me in today's discussions, and I'm going to try and stick within my time limit. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to talk mainly about developments since 1995. My task has been to think about this question of medium in relation to film and video. So 1995 is a year that marked the centennial of cinema. And I'm going to look at the ways in which digitization has been imagined in relation to film, video and cinema. And I'm going to think about some changing concepts of loss and storage and transport. So if we begin with loss, in the early 2000s, the transition from film to digital video in production and also, I think, in projection was very often framed in terms of loss. And this is an example from a kind of film studies context. So we have the extreme clarity of digital video being described as a function of its lack of grain. And we have a very poetic description of grain, bits of silver halide suspended in the emulsion of a film stock, producing luminosity, vividness. And we also have this idea of grain creating kind of endless variation. It's never the same from frame to frame, creating the possibility of something that's unique, even if the content is kind of mundane and static. So we have, it's quite a poetic, it's sort of elegiac in a way. And we see this distinction between the film image that's grainy but alive, and then the DV image, which is somehow less alive, it's less animated. And if we switch then from film studies to art practice, we see this transition from digital technology being framed also in terms of loss. And there are many different contexts where this was articulated, but I'm thinking of the work of the curator, Chrissy Isles. She was one contributor to Kino Museum, a really interesting project that was developed by Mike Sperlinger and Ian White for the Oberhausen Festival. And in the discussion that accompanied Kino Museum, Isles stated, this is a quote from her from a sort of discussion panel, suddenly in the 1990s, when cinema is in crisis, you get artists falling in love with cinema. You get Janet Cardiff building a cinema inside a gallery. A gallery that you can sit into, you enter into this space. You get Steve McQueen doing Buster Keaton, and you get Douglas Gordon bringing Taxi Driver into the gallery. So I think you can see this love of cinema at work also in public art projects, which took the form of temporary movie theatres, and this has been something I've thought about and written about. So the work of the Irish artist Jessie Jones, the drive-in cinema, also work by Slovenian artist Tobias Putra. Again, these temporary cinemas, but they have a very sort of functional quality. So the social and material architecture of cinema, in these cases, offers a way to explore a kind of civic space, a public space. And some of these artists They were interested in working with film, but in a lot of cases they're quite pragmatically using digital video projection in these temporary cinemas. So we have, in these projects, we have a focus on the architecture, the physical architecture, the social architecture. But we also can see in the work of theorists like Erica Balsam a focus on celluloid, the return of celluloid to the gallery. So Balsam cites artists such as Tacita Dean and Matthew Buckingham and Stan Douglas, all of whom have used 16mm film to explore, and this is a quote from her, the contingent, the ephemeral, or the disappearing. So certainly for some artists, and some curators at least, the transition to digital production and projection is imagined in terms of loss and disappearance. But I think since the late 2000s, we see a different understanding of loss that I think is perhaps more open-ended, and I think it's more closely linked to compression. And I think one of the most influential texts, one that is very well known, is Hito Steyerl. So Hito Steyerl's work came up in discussion yesterday evening, and I'm going to mention her work again, primarily her writing. So this is a well-known text that I think most people here will have read. So In Defense of the Poor Image describes practices of compression and storage and circulation, which are really everywhere. They pervade everyday life. So we have this poor image being uploaded, downloaded, shared, reformatted, re-edited. We have it being liberated from the vaults of cinema and archives, thrust into a kind of uncertainty at the expense of its own substance. We also have this notion of an image tending towards abstraction. And we have actions such as smuggling, bartering. And so it's more this notion of resurrection. So if there has been a loss, there's also been a kind of resurrection. So I don't think that Steyerl is elevating poor images over celluloid. That's not her focus. But she does seem to offer a new way of thinking about loss and the processes of loss that are part of compression, so forms of kind of deletion and abstraction. But I think we can also maybe think about other ways in which compression is important for thinkers at the moment. Alexander Galloway's critique of what he calls representational infrastructure in certain forms of philosophy, and that's a critique that he's developing, very much informed by the work of the philosopher Francois Larouelle. So Galloway argues that nature is often imagined to be synonymous with the uncompressed, and he rejects this position. He talks about it as an old story of modernity in which the earth is figured as full of life and energy. So Larouelle's a reference point, but another reference point, perhaps more familiar to me, is from in the context of media studies, Jonathan Stern's analysis of data compression, which focuses on the MP3. So you're going to see a lovely logo now in a minute. So, as most people will know, MP3 is a file format developed with the involvement of MPEG. So MPEG stands for Motion Picture Experts Group. And this is a group that determines the storage and portability, or it's a formatting, a file format that determines storage and portability of digital media. So MPEGs, I mean this is very common knowledge, involve what's called lossy compression. They use algorithms to calculate and selectively delete data that's redundant. And so it's data that can't be perceived by the human eye or ear. So Jonathan Stern focuses particularly on MP3 as the audio component of MPEG. And he talks about MP3 as, and this is a quote, an artifact shaped by several electronics industries, the recording industry, and actual and idealized practices of listening. It is a machine designed to anticipate how its listeners perceive music and to perceive for them. So, much like Hito Steyerl, Jonathan Stern aligns compression with the distracted subject. He notes that built into every MP3 is an attempt to mimic and to some degree to preempt the unconscious dimension of human perception in a noisy, mixed media environments of everyday life. But of course, even if we're in apparently less noisy, distracting environments such as the museum, we don't escape compression. It's present even when we're dealing with high-resolution data files in the form of HD videos, even immaculately installed in acoustically treated art galleries. So we're always dealing with compression. And if we follow the logic of Stern's analysis, in which compression is bound to storage and portability, we have to recognise that artworks that use industrially supported media formats, so regulated by entities like MPEG, and also this is at work in a way when we think about forms of regulation and standardisation that occur with analogue media. all artworks to some extent have a transitional quality to them. And what I mean by this transitional quality or transitional state is the fact that artworks have to survive ongoing processes of industrial obsolescence. They can only achieve this survival through collaborations between artists and curators and collectors and archivists. And I think this transitional status, while it's not unique to digital files, it's very pronounced in the case of digital files. They have to be regularly transferred or migrated to new storage formats and systems. So at this point, I'm going to just think about the relationship between storage and transit from a slightly different perspective and come back to Nita Steyrl's defense of the poor image. She uses a metaphor proposed by Haroon Farrokhi to describe a hierarchy of images. And in this metaphor, there's a notion of a class society with cinema in the role of what he says is a flagship store. So high-end products are marketed in an upscale environment in the flagship store, while affordable derivatives of the same images circulate as DVDs or online as poor images. So with the flagship store, we're thinking about prime retail locations. We're thinking about places that perhaps storage is at a premium. Often these types of flagship stores don't actually stock a huge amount. They're places to touch and view the latest devices, but often as a consumer one is directed then online. So if we think about the flagship store in terms of where it's located, such as this one on Fifth Avenue, we're really thinking about an earlier economy, organised around nation states and their capitals. But actually, Steyrl more recently has shifted to thinking about storage a little bit differently. And she's talked about the free port, and I want to mention another text by her, more recent, Duty-Free Art, in which she draws a little bit on the work of Keller Easterling, among others. And she cites the example of Geneva Freeport, which is a tax-free zone, which incorporates different jurisdictions into one physical complex. So she describes how different jurisdictions run through one and the same building. So some floors are inside the Freeport zone, some are outside. And you have Freeports functioning very particularly in terms of art storage. So one of the things that Keller Easterling points out in relation to Freeports in her book Extra Statecraft is that goods in Freeports are technically in transit. So it's precisely because they're legally in transit but physically located in highly secure storage facilities that they facilitate the accumulation of wealth. So wealth is produced by this combination of transit and a kind of secure storage. So we find this strange conjunction of stasis and transit in this extra state storage. Okay. So how do we reconcile this transitional status with the forces of industrial obsolescence that I've mentioned earlier? How do we reconcile it with this need for digital files to be migrated? We don't really know what lies inside the crates at Geneva Art Freeport, but I wonder if in those crates we would or wouldn't find artworks in the form of digital storage devices, artworks that are subject to these processes of data migration. I'm not sure, I don't know, I'm curious. So I'm wondering if perhaps we're actually dealing with two different models of storage and transit that are actually quite hard to reconcile. This kind of economic model, which relies on sort of legal jurisdictions, and this other model where artworks are always somehow transitional and they have to survive these processes of obsolescence, they have to be migrated. So I don't really have a formal conclusion. I'm going to end by showing a clip of artwork that I'm using to think through some of these relationships between storage and transport and loss. And I'm just going to very briefly introduce it and then show about 1 minute. So it's a work called Afterimage by Clemens von Wiedemeyer, and it was first presented as part of a solo exhibition, The Cast, which took place at Maxi in Rome in 2013. So I don't want to sort of oversimplify this exhibition, but just to mention that the show engaged with the history of epic film production in Rome, specifically at Cinecittà. So it also explored the relationship between the statue, the extra, the actor, referencing political theatre, labour movements and Greek myth. So this is one work called The Beginning, Living Figures Dying. It's a moving image installation composed of sequences from the history of cinema, sequences that depict objects brought to life. So it sort of brings me back to my interest in the living and the dying. But Afterimage is a different work. It adopts a different approach to the sculptural cinematic object. It depicts the interior of the artisan sculptural workshop of Cinears, which is the oldest company located in the Cinecittà complex. It's been run by the same family for 4 generations. they've been producing sculptures and props for cinema since the beginning of the Italian film industry. So most of those types of objects tend to be destroyed after use, but this particular family, the De Angelis family, stored their own output. They also preserved objects from other workshops. So they've produced, in a way, an ad hoc, but quite important material archive of Cinecittà's history. And Clemens von Wiedemeyer's work documents this in a very specific way. So the surfaces of the objects that are gathered inside the workshop, inside the store, were scanned by laser technology, transformed into a point cloud, a system of pixel coordinates that exists in virtual space. An afterimage is a 6-minute animated film made from this data, and it's accompanied by Foley sound of footsteps. It's projected onto a curved screen. And I think in this work, we get a sense of the continued importance of what Erica Balsam terms the contingent, the ephemeral, the disappearing. Because the future of this warehouse is somewhat uncertain. But it's not a work that relies on the materiality of 16mm film, for example. Instead, it gives us this journey through a set of coordinates. And this is my last slide, and it's a short description of the work from Avery Gordon. And she outlines this spectral vantage point, a ghostly figure moving through the workshop rooms as if he or she was in a computer game. And she describes a ghost in the machine, that a ghost that has a will to create, a will to make something from this surplus of hands and heads and arms and legs. So I think here we have a different notion of transit, a spectral motion through a cloud of data. So I'm going to end with a clip. I do hope you have the opportunity to see this work properly. We're just going to look at documentation, so I hope you might get to see it in full at some point. And I really want to thank Clemens von Wiedemeier for giving me permission to show this clip, because it's obviously not the ideal situation in which to see it, but I think it'll give you some sense. So maybe we can do, I know it's possible to dim lights.
I would also have liked to see more of that film, actually. Yeah, I'll introduce the next speaker. He's coming from London. He's a writer, curator, a lot of other things. He's also, oh, did you not know? I think it's better. It's Katrina. Oh, sorry. Okay, we take Katrina now. I'm so sorry. We just talked about, sorry, wait a second. Yeah, oh, my papers. Yeah, but Katrina, she is from New Zealand and Australia, and curator and educator, and has made also quite a lot of exhibitions. And I cannot help to just mention one of the titles, Olia Lialina and Dragon Espen Shield, 1 terabyte of kilobyte age, and 4 The Law of Cats, Felines, Photography, and the Web. And that was in 2012. But now I'll hand over the word to you.
Thank you. Are we going to have this? Fantastic. Hi everyone. I wanted to start my talk today with the observation that the crisis of medium specificity in the context of photography, first brought about by the photograph's alleged dematerialization into data in the 1990s, is already very old, over 25 years old actually. And I thought it'd be interesting to think about this in the context of where we are today, and look back at the post-photographic moment. Because photography's digital revolution was initially described by scholars as the arrival of post-photography in 25 years ago now, in which silicon replaced silver, and in which the radical malleability of the alleged dematerialized digital image called into crisis the perceived truth value of the medium, and sort of triggered a kind of ontological crisis in the medium. So of course, here are some typical examples through which that's sort of discussed. The famous cover of National Geographic from February 1982, where through the magic of digital manipulation, the pyramids were moved slightly. And we can see here the Bedouin camels have been moved slightly on the cover, causing a kind of massive crisis. Artists also responded by exploring the kind of malleability of digital data and what it means that the photograph is unrecognisable materially, and of course in terms of contemporary art, a great success of a digital image that we have here is Gursky's rhyme. But significantly, of course, in those early decades, the photograph persisted mainly as a kind of print rather than a screen-based photographic practice. I'm quite interested in the fact that despite over 2 decades since the death of photography, it has never been more present than ever. So photography courses in the UK continue to attract huge amounts of students who are keen to hone their skills with the camera in order to distinguish themselves as creative authors whose work transcends the photography of their friends, family members and lovers, posting images on Facebook. Huge numbers of people flock to photography exhibitions, and despite only recently hiring its first photography curator and developing its own collection, Tate has now embarked on its own canonisation of the medium. So today I'm interested in returning to the problem that whilst photography has already died a technical death, its analogue corpse continues to be reanimated and exploited by galleries, educators, and the wider photographic industries, concealing the fact that the political and cultural value of photographic reproduction has long since caused a sea change in the way in which we might actually think about authorship, value, and representation. And what is currently being elevated as the present and future of this medium by its institutions is a mirage of analogue photographic heritage. And as we know in contemporary neoliberal culture, heritage sells. And I think this paradox might be understood through a recent experience I had at the Photographers Gallery, where I work somewhat perplexingly as what's termed a digital curator. One evening I decided to attend what's known as a looking group, in which a small group of participants get together to look intensively at a single photograph they are unfamiliar with and read it out loud together. The sessions, according to our gallery website, are focused on slowing down the image and explore the way in which we, as viewers, look at images, bringing into question the difference between looking and seeing. And of course, this is always framed within the kind of crisis of visual literacy that digital media have brought about, like how do we begin to read and understand the photographic image as a software output. But interestingly, in spite of this anxiety around digital culture and photographic ubiquity, this session actually adopted the tools of analog photographic culture to decode the image And the image in question was this black and white image of a Berlin factory taken by David Lynch and was led by a facilitator. And up on the floors we were exhibiting a blockbuster show of celebrity photographers William Burroughs, Andy Warhol and David Lynch. So participants spent some time looking at and discussing David Lynch's artistic vision, speculating on his choice of subject, the expressive way he captured the formal qualities of light and shadow and its relationship to the aesthetic of his films. And it was interesting as I sat there listening that the key task of unpacking the photograph was to look at what it said or spoke of, or the meaning and the intention of the author. A process in which, despite looking in a very detailed way at this photograph, it was primarily read as an artistic vision captured through technological means. It puzzled me as time wore on that whilst the group earnestly and patiently interrogated this image they called a photograph, no one ever seemed to notice that what they had been presented with was not an actual photograph, but light reflected off a slightly beige screen in 16:9 ratio coming from a data projector that was giving off a faint hum, in a gallery space which has an architecture of aesthetic modernism. Now, whilst I'm not suggesting we should reduce the image to its technological substrate, it occurred to me that the apparatus of the photographic was made completely invisible. And the photograph continues to be read in contemporary culture as a kind of transparent window, not a software output, not a processual image, which relies on an assemblage of software and hardware produced by engineers, salespeople, and other actors tasked with reanimating a binary blob of data into something which a human would interpret as being culturally continuous with a photograph. But perhaps it's not surprising. Photography's historical quest to be accepted as an artistic medium has meant that it was representation, not reproduction, it was bound to. Art institutions, curators and collectors are deeply invested in defending cultural value of their photographic collections, which have been based on mechanical, not computational reproduction. And it's just worth highlighting here, as I did in the Amsterdam talk, that photography was not always associated with modernist ideas of authorship, and the medium was not initially going to be covered under the US Copyright Act of 1865. And it was actually photographers who, in their fight to have the medium accepted, embraced pictorialism, which imbued the image with a painterly aesthetic through manipulation of the photographic process. And through that, they actually managed to get photography protected by copyright law, and as it was deemed sufficiently original. And later, actually, the copyright law was challenged by those who argued that machines produce photographs and not human beings. But the court disagreed once more, declaring photographs were authored by people, and therefore it is a creative medium. So, although pictorialism was eventually abandoned as a strategy, what remained was an emphasis on originality and creativity. And I guess today the problem is no longer that the medium is dismissed as the inferior handmaiden to science and art, as in the 19th century, but rather that it's privileged as a medium for the production of artworks rather than a system of dissemination and reproduction. And the problem of hiring digital curators such as myself or Ben here is that digital technologies do not in themselves represent a new medium for photographers or artists, but are actually a hybrid and converged set of practices which are underpinned by highly specific assemblages of bodies, code, and hardware in the process of undergoing radical obfuscation. And I think it's telling that neither the majority of cultural organisations in the UK nor the Arts Council of England address the digital turn as a shift in knowledge system or cultural value, but usually defines it in one of three ways. As either the arrival as a new medium for art, in which digital artists are valorised as the new avant-garde, or secondly as a broadcast medium for sharing cultural content with a global audience, in which the content's just repackaged and delivered in digital form. And as a new business model and audience metric that we can begin to understand how museums and galleries can become a business. So let me just quickly return to the zombie corpse of photography and its genealogy. Anne-Marie Willis, writing in the early digital era, was the first to describe the shift away from analogue imaging processes in these macabre terms. She says, digitization is a process which is cannibalizing and regurgitating photographic and other imagery, allowing the production of simulations of simulations. Here, like a zombie, photography's corpse is reanimated by a mysterious new process to inhabit the earth. And yet, during this period, of course, photography still was haunted by dematerialization truth, and it was representation, not reproduction, that was the focus of the first crisis of photography. But she raised a really important point, and that is that despite us all standing here and going, well, of course, we've entered into a kind of post-medium world in which all these things become quite complex, and older Enlightenment categories of dualist thinking are breaking down. There is actually no perceived crisis of representation for those who are developing the technologies of the hyperreal, and that, you know, if you have a look at any of the kind of computing science papers that are currently released, developing personal information management, facial recognition in consumer cameras, search engines which assess the aesthetic value of photographs, sort of these sorts of texts remain untroubled by the history of representation or its crises. And here is the Images in the Wild project, which is a database of photographs scraped off the internet that you can download and train your algorithms to read. And I love how it says images in the wild, so we've captured these images on the internet in the wild. And you too can explore the database. And of course we then see these technologies moving into cameras, facial recognition, smile detection. And in the wider photography press, on the left-hand side we see this ad for the Casio Excellent camera, your millisecond makeover, improve your image with this makeup mode on the camera, so this idea of creativity is being sold, and on the other hand, rationality is being sold through the medium, capture the truth with a 24.6 megapixel camera. Okay, so however, the zombie photography conjured by 1990s post-photography is a new kind to the one which is sustained by institutions such as my own today. As Andrew Dewdney notes, zombie photography might be approached as either the continuation of the analogue in digital terms, or conversely, the contemporary networked image simulating the analogue, in which the screen is the predominant social mode of reception of the digital image. He says the former is achieved through digital technology producing the photographic print image, and the second through the internet's transparent interface. In this sense, he observes the photographic paradox results in not a message without a code, but a code without a message, in which representation is reasserted, but only to mask this process of simulation. So it relates to sorts of ideas around the black boxing of technology and what is going on behind the interface here. We can't see what's behind the interface because we're so busy looking at the photograph as picture. And a great example of this is the Google Art project, which is a great example of this problem, which is a sophisticated interface for experiencing art which trades on the photographic, which becomes invisible. It operates as an assemblage of database structures, metadata schemas, gigapixel cameras, curators, interface designers, in which the notion of the zoom like the zoom of the lens, the zoom of the software, brings you closer to some kind of truth within the painting. And certainly in my discussions with the engineers who built this system, there is a definite realignment of, oh yes, if we can go in mechanically into the object, it will reveal some kind of way of reaching some kind of truth in the image. So again, trading on this idea of the photographic and what it can do. So I guess my conclusion then would be that we should be interested not in medium, but in mediation. Medium proposes a sense of stability both in terms of the art object and its institutions. However, photography, cinema, or digital art are not general forms, but function as an unstable assemblage of technologies arranged in a system. As I've argued today, one important task is to understand how concepts of medium are operationalized in the service of, as Alan Sekula has noticed, on the one hand bourgeois art, which exploits the subjectivity of the photograph on the one hand, and bourgeois science, which exploits the rationality of the photographer's knowledge, even as these distinctions are being complicated through convergence. And here a different kind of medium specificity might emerge, as Sean Kubert has argued, based on what is specific to a specific work or practices, in which media are understood as constructs or imaginary engines. And so whilst we might understand that medium specificity in art is over, the values and cultural forms remain through computational remediation and the persistence of these categories through which audience understand the work. So the task, in conclusion, should not be to help animate the zombie of photography or exploit the circuits of new forms of circulation, but to make it visible as a kind of hegemony. Long day. Okay, so whilst we stare and slow down the image and understand its meaning using the reassuring tools of semiology, I'd just like to point out that Google's implementing RDA-FA protocols to ensure that the encoding of machines, of images by machines are read in a radically different way. And whilst practitioners might respond by turning to unique photographic processes to valorize modernist authorship, Getty is releasing its image archives for free in order to harvest contextual metadata to become the ideal data-driven image producer responding to market demands. And so I thought I would end with this quote by Daniel Rubinstein, for me, which rings true in this context, that contemporary digital photography is characterized not by the outstanding work of the few, but by the middling work of the many. Rather than a system for the production of works of art, photography today is a system of dissemination and reproduction in which the individual image is a nodal point or a fractal shape which has no representational value in and of itself, but which participates in economies of meaning through connections with other, ostensibly meaningless images. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now you actually already introduced Ben as digital curator. You talked about Google, and you arrived with your speech on Google Doc. I hope it works. Nevertheless, you also present yourself as Luddite, apart from working at Serpentine. I give you the word now. So,
thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Can we on? Okay. I think that was really great. I have like a lot of sympathy. And I had no idea how what I'm going to present would segue into anything anybody else was saying, but it seems like it's going okay. So hopefully this will make sense. Usually when I speak, I'm talking about like infrastructure, open source, latent potential and hacker movements and how that might relate to art or not. But I didn't really feel like that would be appropriate in this context, or at least I felt a kind of discomfort. There's something kind of weird about the closure or the end of a chapter that comes to a conference or event of this nature. Something about it kind of reminded me of the Just Chillin' exhibition in New York in 2011. At that time it felt like a kind of funeral or a kind of point of departure for a small community of peers. And it seems though that wasn't closure, and now it's kind of merely this like really poorly documented footnote in a larger narrative, or this like continual expansion for a set of ideas, individuals, personal brands, despite a kind of enormous fragmentation. And so instead of kind of trying to advance a concise and well mapped out position that might be expected of me, I thought I'd try and present in a way that I rarely do and talk about the past. And I want to talk about an exhibition that I co-curated in 2010 with artists Emily Jones and Ian Bull at Limazulu Project Space. I was kind of confronted and perplexed by the question of the digital as medium put forth by this panel and my place within that discussion. I've kind of really struggled to make sense of what's come to pass in the last 5 years since that show. And in order to respond to this idea, I'm going to try and go backwards in an attempt to answer the questions we were asking then, so to try and understand how they relate to now, and implicitly ask whether through participation in the institutionalization of such thinking, have played kind of an active role in undermining some of the form of latent or alternative potential in what we've kind of come to define as the digital. So the title of this show was Let's Go Outside, and this was lifted from the lyrics of the popular song by George Michael, Outside, as in, let's go outside in the sunshine, I know you want to, but you can't say yes. At the time of the show, there hadn't really been a formalization of terms, certain aesthetics weren't fixed, there weren't many anchor points, things felt really fluid, there certainly weren't any art forum articles or frieze reviews or conferences, the way that this stuff was being talked about in a particular community. And not everybody was online and not everyone was sharing, archiving and promoting their work. And despite initially sharing documentation of this show, it was only online for a few months, and after being taken down, mainly because I don't keep an online archive. But I wanted to try and walk through the process of that show, not with any kind of deep analysis or newly applied framework, but rather to return to some of these questions, because I feel like they haven't been sufficiently answered since, and we certainly didn't answer them. And I'm concerned that through a set of decisions made over these 5 years, that we've kind of foreclosed on the possibility of them being answered. And as you might have guessed, the title of the show alludes to this kind of zoning in on a possibility of an outsider art in the age of the internet. What that outside and exterior might look like, how it could possibly function, and whether the interior is likely to produce the best conditions under which to refine a creative practice in this moment. I guess by interior I mean the art world. And we were thinking, at the time we were thinking about filter bubbles, coexistence of things, a multiverse, prosuming. What did it mean to be producing on what felt like a flat surface, somewhat fragmented, with no obvious validation system in play, no gallery recognition, but a set of tools that we've been taught, the white cube, the press release, the group discussion, and how they held up, and whether they were blunted. And we wanted to kind of put to test Groys's suggestion that there existed a horizontal field of all possible pictorial forms, one after another so-called primitive artworks, abstract forms, and simple objects from everyday life have all acquired the kind of recognition that once used to be granted only to the historically privileged artistic masterpieces, and what that amounted to in respect to the continued existence of specialisms. And if we were cynical, it was only for those who we'd gone to art school with, or shared a discursive space. Everything we put into the exhibition, Let's Go Outside, was sincere and done with a curiosity and a desire to understand, not just the potential inefficiency of our own tools, but what we did not know. And I guess back then I also kind of believed right now that we'd be sitting in circles speaking openly en masse, and not stood on so many podiums. And I guess things don't work out how you think they do. So these are just some installation shots of the show. And I guess the important thing to really explain is the artists that were included didn't necessarily come from the art world per se. There were things that we found online. And this is Geo Park. We were interested in his work because he seemed to kind of track reports on new technologies, advertisements, screen captures from Facebook. And we were interested in the way in which he portrayed these in his life. And we followed these streams online consistently for about 2 years. Other artists in the show and I think people will be familiar with this, is Wendy Vainity, who produced these kind of insane, what seemed insane films, like really, really intense with these kind of 3D doppelgangers and these kind of voiceovers, and there was a real kind of, I guess, a kind of rawness that at the time with the kind of popularization of Ryan Carton's work, it was trying to understand these things in respect to one another. We also featured Vincent Oskala, who spent 4 years designing the perfect SimCity 3000 hellscape called Magasanto. We also included Cassie Lian, known online as Mrs. January, who ran a blog which focused on kind of money-saving experts, ways of getting massive reductions at Walmart. But what was really incredible was the way, and I feel like this is a poor representation because some of the images are really epic with these like symmetric installation shots, and so we recreated these. Also around this time there was there was this image circulating on Tumblr of somebody in like a silver burqa. And it became really popular, it was like trending. We managed to track this image down to a Flickr account, and then we contacted the Flickr account, and it turned out that these images and these works were being produced by somebody called Stephen Cooper, who was a 70-year-old retired engineer that lived in North London, and we met with him at the ICA and talked to him, and we really genuinely wanted to understand, because we were trying to understand what our work meant in the kind of same space. And he was really generous and loaned us, and you can see them in the show here. He loaned us some of the burqas. And there was a kind of desperation to understand how these things sit alongside each other. And also what it meant, because if you take Vincent's video, for example, it's had over 1 million views. And there was a lot of artworks that were kind of trying to seek an audience or talking about a public that were being posted online. And we tried to understand how these things worked in parallel. And maybe I'll read I mean, it sounds really naive now, but I'll read a quote from the press release. We said, does then the dividing line between the aforementioned internet new wave and the alternative producer exist in motive, insomuch as the trending practice for artists is to create autonomous artifacts for inspection, while the works, objects displayed in the show function online as documentation of an existence and or the ephemera of a personal project? What do we stand to gain from identifying these dividing lines when inevitably in the not-so-distant future they will be broken down? The very existence of this show contributing towards the destruction of such divisions. Now, it might seem massively naive, and in hindsight it kind of feels like it is, and I'm trying to work out over the last week where that naivety sits and how it might relate to the medium of the digital, and maybe I'll get to how that actually might relate. So there was another aspect to this show. So if we just skip back to one of the shots, there's a cardboard cutout, and there was no mention of this in the press release. It wasn't on the floor plan, but it kind of sat in the corner of the gallery. And this is Vincent Uraib. Vincent runs a project. I think he still runs a project space in Chicago, where there's a kind of really strong apartment scene for doing shows and performances in your home. And there was a particular performance which I won't go into the detail of, because I think there's a kind of another subject about kind of deeply problematic misogyny that's present within 4chan culture. But there was a performance called Interior Semiotics, which blew up on a 4chan thread and was viewed by millions and millions of people online in the space of a couple of days. And what was really interesting was the way that these images started being produced. And these conversations on Reddit, talking about fucking hipsters, and kind of categorizing, trying to understand how you could have every type of hipster within the audience. And it was really, what was really interesting was trying to understand how this kind of outside on the internet perceived a kind of interior, or like what were quite sincere emergent practices. And so we put Vincent in the show as a kind of avatar for everybody that visited the show, because we were trying to understand this like projection back and forth. And I don't know if we achieved anything specific in doing this, and I'm still trying to kind of work through some of the problems. But I guess I'm speaking about this now because I'd imagine that the conditions of what we might term digital, post-internet, or whichever term history comes to rest itself upon, would lead to a greater interplay between those engaged in divergent forms of cultural production on the internet. That through experimentation and convergence on a kind of expanded field of possibility that experiments as this kind and similar ways of working would lead to an increased curiosity of spirit that we kind of perform, enabling an open dialogue online and off between those that make things and put them into the world. And it kind of seems that it doesn't happen. One that accounts for a kind of intensified diversity and increased access, increased access, whilst also enabling and making it acceptable a kind of messiness, a kind of unknowing, above and beyond the sophisticated commentary or kind of generative diagrams of the same concepts that we seem to be kind of caught in this kind of endless feedback loop of commenting on the present. And I've got some suspicions as to why this might be, but there's a really great quote by Zygmunt Bauman that I've been thinking about, and I think it kind of extrapolates and surmises the kind of outcome of what we begin to perceive as a filter bubble during the time of the show in 2010. And if you forgive me, it's quite long, but I'll read it. The online half of the dual universe we inhabit offers the possibility of sweeping the challenges of cohabitation with diversity under the carpet. The kind of possibility almost inconceivable in the offline world, in a school, workplace, neighbourhood, city, street. Instead of facing up to such challenges point blank and embarking on the long, bumpy and tortuous road leading from sociality to cooperation and solidarity, it tempts visitors with an elsewhere, unattainable luxury of fencing off, rendering irrelevant and ignoring. Facebook networks of friends are digital equivalents of massively material gated communities. Though, unlike their offline replicas, they don't need CCTV and armed guards at the entry. Fingers of the network's composers, manager, consumer, once armed with a mouse and the magic delete key would suffice. And I guess I kind of see the continued rarefication, the refinement of this terminology in the field that we call the digital or network technologies or post-digital or post-internet or whatever, as a kind of major contributing factor in the enclosure and foreclosure in the places we have made the home of our work, or at very least the primary distribution platform, whether expressed through social media performances, Facebook back channels, or just one's own personal online archive. And in this process, this seems compacted by also a kind of collusion with spaces, which for a very short time, around the time of making this show, seemed impossible. As you saw the shift from a kind of very fervent and sincere interplay to a kind of regrounding of the active forms that people were producing back into the gallery as the kind of only rightful place for the objects being produced, rather than an investment of time and energy in what was required to build sufficient permission mechanisms, entry points, and inclusive portals. That energy seems to be expelled instead on the guaranteed foreclosure of such possibilities. And whilst none of this may matter, I fear this way of working and building space in the world may consign us, or at least work of this nature, to an irrelevant corner of cultural history. And in considering this, I've been asking myself a set of questions of what happens to the digital when we hold conferences on it, when we dedicate jobs to it, namely mine. What happens when we can't distinguish between the language of tech startup and art conferences, when indistinguishable gestures are made in both Silicon Valley and our museums? How do we separate and set ourselves apart, and how can anyone be sure that what we're doing is for good reason? And whilst meditating and reflecting on these things, something that's come up in my mind is something I've been trying to understand about distance. Undocumented distance and what's lost or gained in drawing a line from one lineage or action to another. And so I was thinking about Gordon Matta Clark's Food, and then I was thinking about this, and then I was thinking about Etoy, and then I was thinking about this, Art Rank, and then I was thinking about DLD and digital life design, global network on innovation, digitization, science, culture, which connects business. I was thinking about Future Everything. I participated in Future Everything, South by Southwest, and really deeply struggling to understand. I've also tried to think about my kind of gut reaction and response to certain shows, particularly Ubermorgan's show, Carol Fletcher, and the way that Vote Auction was positioned in the gallery. And having seen this work when I was like 17 or 18, and trying to reconcile my relationship to it in that space. I guess the last thing I wanted to say is I'm not sure whether or not acts of historical insurgency are capable of producing the desired outcome. If on the kind of long arc of history, small gestures, historical correctives are a necessary forebearer in undoing what has been forgotten, whether we should have any desire in closing those gaps. And I think, if that made any sense, I'm done.
Thank you, Ben. Well, it made sense, but of course we all speak very fast, and there is a lot of compression going on and a lot of loss, as Maeve talked about. That was one of the first things we were talking about. Then you talked about that a loss is also like a resurrection, and And we have resurrection everywhere, I suppose, because we have compression going on everywhere. We have this storage, we have an archive taking care of things in a collective manner, which is also, in that way, a bit horizontal, as you talked about, Ben. And then Katrina, she talked about that we start to view images differently as software output, and that photo. Then you talked about the whole struggle about how photo had to get accepted as an artistic medium, but then at a time of hybridization, that's of course a bit difficult getting accepted as a medium, I was thinking, when things are changing and mediums are debunked, and the concept itself. And then we arrived at, and then you touched on Google Art Projects, pretty important, I think. Interesting, and then we arrived at you, Ben, with your presentation of Let's Go Outside. And these questions about whether there is an outside to digitization, whether the art world is an interior, as you suggested, in network culture, whether there is an inside-outside, so I guess maybe it's an outside of networks, I don't know. Then you also touched about what has already been touched upon, this sort of like digitization as a leveling of art and culture, as a democratization, and then I guess actually then you seem to start to mourn the development, of course, referencing Elie Paris's book, The Filter Bubble, that we have this internet now where we get caught in these caught by these personalization algorithms and gated communities. So Facebook becomes these gated communities, and that's pretty interesting because we have this mourning that you described going on previously in the 90s. But there are still people actively mourning, like you've been, and you also describe yourself as a Luddite, though you use Google Docs. Sorry, I get back to that. Yeah, so I was thinking should we continue mourn, or should we try to look at the potentials developing? And would the medium still be a key question in that matter? Yeah.
Start. I don't know if I am mourning. I kind of took that because I feel like it's okay to kind of have continual death cycles. I didn't talk about the things that I really believe in because I wanted to try and work through the problems. And I didn't want to necessarily thrust these problems on the audience or other practitioners. I guess what I'm explicitly doing is I'm trying to explain why people should be vigilant of my role and people's roles like this within institutions. And I think this was something that Katrina really hit on, I think, much more eloquently than I did, of this feeling of kind of complicity in something you don't necessarily believe in, and you might have the ability to shift those parameters, but there's these weird things happening in kind of infrastructural space that are preventing that from happening.
Is it complicity? Is it reviving these old categories and?
I don't feel like we can even get to a conversation about medium right now.
Yeah.
I would love to. I would really love to.
Yeah. What do you think?
I guess my whole point about medium was that medium, as it's understood within the context of contemporary art, conceals the politics of the image, which has really moved elsewhere. And I think, I didn't get to say this about the Google Art Project, for example, but here we have Google Art Project separating the images of, you have Google Image Search over here, which is this anarchic space which my students would normally go to get a retrospective of a photographer. And then you have the hermetically sealed Google Cultural Institute with the Google Art Project, with the greatest and the good of contemporary art, which gets made, revealed through this kind of photographic apparatus. But the thing is about that is that, of course, this is always celebrated as the democratization of art and accessibility and all these great liberal values. However, if you were to ask someone from the Google Art Project, is the metadata that you're accumulating about the way in which people view art it gets generated as a byproduct of this? Is this a public cultural value, and should you be releasing it back to the community? But we can't even have that discussion because we're still stuck.
But Google, they are like, I suppose, maybe the art institution reviving old categories like painting.
Yeah, and because cultural authority is established on that.
Yeah. So maybe there is no great difference between the private and public actors in that respect. There is a lot of interest vested in the concept of the medium. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting in terms of foreclosure as well, because of course digital reproduction as well creates a kind of second, a documentation of the art object, which itself is where photographic institutions, because a photograph might be in the public domain, but you can then control its reproduction by rephotographing it, and you then marketize that. So it's this kind of question of public and private is quite complex. And the rhetoric of democratization is, of course, part of that.
Yeah, I guess public-private, that's a binary, like so many other binaries that are like disintegrating with digitization.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of dynamic of public-private is something I was interested in looking at how cinema was being staged architecturally and socially as a kind of almost metaphor for a sort of a shared space. But then I think what you can see now maybe is a more sort of variability and a more opening out of different notions of territory, different notions of, we were talking about kind of enclosure and gatedness. I think there's maybe emerging more variability and more complexity around what we mean by these kind of spatial formations that bring people together or divide them. And I think it's interesting that infrastructure has kind of come up in various ways across the different presentations, and I think it came up last night in David Justlet's talk as well, that we're moving from some sort of more maybe amorphous notion of a public and a private space towards more sort of complex, more nuanced articulations of what we mean by these legal and industrial and infrastructural formations.
Yeah, so we're talking instead about processes like transition, and you proposed to talk about mediation instead of medium. So with all this movement going on, this motion, this transition and mediation, maybe it's difficult to keep these old categories, whether it's the art historical like medium and medium specificity going, and maybe it's also difficult to keep others like public, private, commercial, non-commercial.
Toke, I think it's time to open the discussion to the public because we have a pretty tight schedule, I'm afraid.
Okay, so I guess now we take a few brief questions, maybe not comments, but questions. Yeah, please, should we give a mic to the speaker of that?
Can you hear me? Yeah? My question is for Maeve. Maeve, thanks for that great presentation. I was interested in how you brought up the notion of resurrection, and you can really see it in the claimants on Wedemeyer at the end. And I was wondering if you're using that to try to get away from this dynamic of loss and mourning. If you were setting that against transportation as a way of getting out of this last morning idea, or what was the exact relation that you were drawing between the two?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm still working this out. I mean, the term resurrection comes up in Hito Stiles' defence of the poor image, so it's very, it's one kind of, I suppose, action, or it implies maybe a kind of, perhaps a kind of agency. But I think with, I am trying to think about different types of motion and different types of transit, and I guess I was struck by Avery Gordon's description of this ghostly figure moving through a space that has game-like quality, and she can introduce this notion of a machine. So I think that's something I want to kind of look at a little bit more, and I didn't have a conclusion to my thoughts really, but I think that there might be, for me, like what I might be interested in is mapping out different notions of motion or transit, and that perhaps this kind of ghostly figure moving through this this data cloud is something that, to me, that's quite compelling, because I think it suggests a sort of a way of thinking about the data cloud in terms of spatially separate from the motion through it. And I'm not sure why I'm interested in that, but I know I am. And there's a suggestion of process that's implied in her picturing of this ghostly figure that is going to do something with these bits and pieces of like heads and arms and legs. So I think I'm sort of trying to think through different possible ideas of motion. But yeah, I don't have a more resolved answer.
Next question? Another question? Maybe no longer? Yeah? Please.
Yeah, I've two questions, one for Katrina and one for Ben. So first, Katrina, thank you for your talk. I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit or elaborate a little bit about your suggestion that we should maybe move from medium to mediation. Because this is a thing that you're of course, you hear that more often in media studies of new media, you know, W.J.T. Mitchell or Mark Hansen, Joanna Zielinska come to mind, and many others, right? And I've always intuitively felt, yes, I feel that's good, you know, moving from object to process or something like that, you know, from noun to verb, the process of mediating. But lately I've just been kind of stuck there at the same time. It's like, isn't it also a kind of an easy way out, in the sense, you know, no disrespect, of course, but you defer further thinking about this object or phenomena that we still use in the concept of medium, right? So what does it get us? And then for Ben, one by one, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sorry, what do you mean by how you defer thinking about it?
Well, if you say, okay, we shouldn't maybe think about the notion of the medium and rather focus on, you know, the process of mediation, I just don't know. It opens up a lot of room for a different set of questions, but I don't think that we can do without still continuing to think what is happening to the medium. Because we still are, you know, there's still this notion of the medium. I mean, we have a panel on it, artists,
I'm constantly being asked to be on panels about medium specificity.
Exactly, and I think, so what is it, maybe just very frankly, what good does it do for thinking about the medium when we switch terms and talk about mediation?
Well, I think it's problematic to think about the digital as a medium. You know, it is this endless kind of leveling off of many different kind of very specific processes, assemblages, and so on. And so I guess you know, the reason, I mean, I come from media and cultural studies, so it's obviously a position I'm sympathetic with, because it's important to understand how these technologies are operationalized in the world. And it allows you to get away from this idea of the art object. What the art context basically does is turns technology back into an object. And it's an attempt to kind of begin to talk about these other things that lie outside at least in the way I've posed it in photography, the representational frame of the image. And I guess what I was trying to do is say, well, medium is very useful as an idea. It's very useful to many different people, but why is it useful and how is it being used? From technology manufacturers to, my own institution, and we need to be mindful of that as a kind of problem as well. So moving to looking behind the interface, looking at interrogating and making it visible within, that might be a good job for the artist to be doing, and many people are doing that.
And then the notion of mediation helps you do that. You know?
Well, I just think, I guess what I was saying is the wrong question is medium, and maybe a better way of thinking about it is mediation. And certainly that's not a new idea, like most of the things we're talking about in the presentation.
That's pretty clear. Cool. And Ben Vickers' question?
Yeah, it's just, I know and you just stated again, right, you don't feel ready to talk about the medium right now, or you don't feel quite comfortable talking about the medium. I'm sorry, but I still want to push you a little bit, because I really think you gave a great talk here, and you addressed some really crucial issues in relation to the state of cultural and political economy of the art world, or whatever you want to call it, or particular niches. But surely these have their repercussions as well for how we think about either the medium or mediation. So I'm just wondering how you would maybe flip back or relate to what you just talked about, which is very crucial, to if there's any way we could still, this being a panel on the medium, that still relate this back to the notion of medium or mediation. Or if
this is going to sound really sly, but I actually do think there is categorically a way of talking about it, and if you watch the recording of this talk back later and slow down the frames of like the last 20 slides that I showed, I think that there is something within that, but I think there's a problem, and I keep thinking about, I can't stop thinking about Keller Eastling's work at the moment, because I think within this space it gives you a set of tools, and you hear this phrase that she says over and over again, which is a stone set in the water. What if the water was a more curious subject to look at? And then she makes this differentiation between the active form and the object form. And I think that one of the things that I'm really struggling with is like when you start to look at this kind of infrastructural space, and whether that be like a whole institution, or it be an individual, or it be an essay, or it be, and trying to understand how the different components go together, and whether they're operating as an active form in that they're trying to transform something else, or they're acting as an object form that will be like solidified into a kind of historical point. And so the uneasiness in my talk is because I'm conscious that I've been placed in a position where I can create certain object forms that people will pay attention to. And therefore I feel this responsibility to continually disrupt that. And I guess that's an issue of mediation, if that goes some way to explaining it.
So you sort of like say that all these processes we have been talking about, at a certain point they solidify the structures?
Well,
and
just the very form that we're sat on stage as the experts runs contrary to some of the things that we've come to understand about the world, but we haven't created the space and time in which to think about how to do it otherwise. Like, I consistently run things like this because it's really difficult to sit in a circle with 50 people and have a coherent conversation. But it seems like it's something that we should try and do, but there's never the space or the time. And I guess, in a way, I'm kind of questioning that. And I felt a lot of affinity with a lot of the things that you were expressing in your talk. And I think that your talk also operated in exactly some of the things that I just kind of described, right? Like, we're all aware that there's this kind of latent conspiracy, and we're just like, how the hell do we get out? And I don't mean the institution, I love my job.